Good morning. If you want to keep your Bibles open to John chapter 5, we're going to be spending some time looking at the story that Ryder just read for us. Some of you might be thinking that your translation looks a little bit different than what he read. Some of the words might be different. Some of the words might be missing entirely, or you might have extra words. We're going to look at some of the interesting things that we discover as we dig into this 5th chapter of the Gospel of John. Something I want to really highlight that's going on here is there's a remarkable shift that's beginning to occur. John chapter 5 starts what can only be described as a move from resistance towards Jesus to outright rejection. Ryder only read through through verse 14, but as we start to dig further into the text in future lessons, we're going to recognize that what Jesus performed and the day on which he performed it has in many ways signaled the end of what is going to be his life. And so there's a remarkable change that begins here. And it's going to progressively be drawn out more and more by our author. But there's something else that you maybe noticed. This is the third sign of the book of John. We've been noting that John prefers to not speak about the miracles as miracles, but rather call them signs. He's trying to reveal something to us through them. And we noted that he had turned water into wine as the first sign in Cana, and then also he had healed a man's son also in the region of Cana. These were the first two signs that he performed, but this marks the third one. But what you might have also noticed is the repeat emphasis of water in John's gospel. That John has been drawing our attention to water over and over again, and that's not on accident. He has got a purpose for that. And I think we can recognize it as we think about some of the ways that he does this. In John chapter 2, we see that first miracle, turning water into wine. But then he's going to move from that. He's going to have a conversation with this Jewish rabbi, Nicodemus. And as he speaks to him, he's going to share how new life, new birth occurs through water and the Spirit. And then we'll go into John chapter 4, and there we'll learn that Jesus meets a woman at the well, and he refers to something called living water that is made available, that he has the ability to make available to her. And then in John chapter 6, we're going to see him walking on water. And then John chapter 7, he's going to tell the people who are struggling to understand his teaching that if they would believe in him, he would offer to them or create in them a fountain of living water springing up to eternal life. All of this in the first 7 chapters of John, repeatedly pointing back to water. And the reason for that is because John has a narrative in his mind as he reveals what Jesus is doing. And that narrative is the narrative of the Exodus. And we can maybe immediately start to think of areas of the Exodus where water is incredibly significant. We're not going to turn back to all these, but in Exodus chapter 2, Moses, whose name means drawn, that's that Moshe, that means drawn. We learn there in chapter 2 that the daughter of Pharaoh names him that because he was drawn from the water. He was drawn out of the Nile where his mom had placed him to send him to safety. We also can recall that in Exodus chapter 7, the very first plague that comes on Egypt, when Pharaoh refuses to let the children of God go, the first plague is the turning of water into blood at the Nile. And then, of course, after he does let them go, there's the most significant display of water in the Exodus account, the crossing of the Red Sea, where the Israelites walk over what was covered in water, but now is dry ground because of the power of God. We will also see during the wilderness wandering, bitter water being turned into sweet water, times of no water that is turned into times of refreshing from very unusual sources, water coming out of a rock. Over and over again, we see pictures of the Exodus having to do with water. And John's gospel seems to fixate on those same things as well. Here in chapter 5, we have him fixating on the waters at the pool of Bethesda. Now, your translation may say Bethsaida, as Ryder's translation also said. That is because that is this very same name of the same pool, only in Aramaic. In Hebrew, it was called Bethesda. In recognizing what's going on here, I think it's important for us to set up a few details of the backstory, just to figure out the context of which Jesus comes, because the message is not just about healing, although that is a powerful, powerful point in it. So what are some things that occur here? Number one, we learn it's a feast of the Jews. And some of your translations may translate it the feast of the Jews. There are some manuscripts that contain that definite article at the beginning of this, but most just call it a feast. Interestingly, John doesn't seem to want to really hammer out exactly which feast this is. But there's a few things we do know about it. One, we know it's a major feast. It is one of the feasts. When I say a major feast, what I mean is it's one of the feasts that God required the children of Israel to gather before him. So you had to come to the temple and you had to present yourself. There are 3 feasts that are major feasts in the Old Testament. Leviticus 23 talks about all of these. They are Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacle. And a few things we know about them, because unfortunately, I think we just probably don't know very much about them at all. We might recognize a little bit of the language of the Passover thanks to the Lord's Supper, but overall, we just kind of know there was some feasts the Jews had to do. We don't keep festival days, and therefore we don't need to know anything about them. I think we can learn a lot from some of the things that are going on, and I think John expects us to know a little bit about these feasts because he's going to use them throughout his gospel. So the Passover feast is a springtime feast. It occurs in our March and April time frame. So during that time, the Jews would gather together. They would come to Jerusalem. They would come to the temple, and they would remember how God had spared them from death and from Egypt. Through the sacrifice of the lamb, through the blood of the lamb on their doorpost, they are commemorating the moment when the angel of death passed over house to house and gave them safety and ultimately allowed them to be released from a place that they had no power to release themselves from. I think that's important. And I think that might be something that is intended in this very story that we're reading in John 5. They had no power to heal, rescue themselves from Egypt. And God came and delivered them. And then you have the Feast of Pentecost. This is a summer feast. And it would happen at the close of the gathering in of the wheat harvest. And when they would come in, they were giving thanks for the wheat. They were giving thanks for what God had done amongst them to give them this blessing. But if you turn to Leviticus 23 and about verse 22, you'll see that it's not just a festival about giving thanks. It's a festival about renewing compassion and love and giving to others. In fact, they were ordered, as you glean in the rest of your harvest, you are to leave the edges untouched so that those who are poor, those who do not have, can come and they can take from the corners of your fields. Now go to Acts chapter 2 in your minds, and what do we read? We read on the day of Pentecost, during this feast about God, thanking God for the harvest that He has given, 3,000 people are harvested into the family of God. Jesus tells us before, look, the fields are white with harvest. They're ready. Well, now we see that harvest taking place. 3,000 people are added to the church, and what do? There's nobody who has a need because everybody gives. They're doing what they recognized Pentecost was truly about. They're doing it to the fullest extent within the church. And then you have the Feast of Tabernacles. That is the fall feast. This, although many would look to the Passover and say this is the feast, the Passover feast, many would say it's the Tabernacle feast. In fact, John is going to call it the Feast of the Jews in a couple chapters. This is a fall feast that commemorates God as He was with them through the wilderness, providing for them. They didn't have homes. They didn't have a place that was fixed. And they were moving from place to place, but God provided food in the form of manna and quail, and He provided water. And that is what this feast remembers, as the children of Israel would live in booths or tabernacles or tents of sorts. They would live in non-permanent structures as they remembered this feast. And these feasts, these events, they come up during the Gospel of John, and I don't think they come up just solely to mark chronology. It's not just so that we know exactly when things are happening. Now, there is a good deal of effort to do that, and I do believe the Gospel of John is a chronological book, and we know there are 3 Passovers that take place, and that coincides with the ministry of Jesus, which was about 3.5 years. Some will turn to John chapter 5 and say that means that this must be a Passover, because that would give us 4 Passovers, which would occur in 3.5 years. But I don't think that that's exactly what John's wanting to do. I think what he's really wanting to do is thematically show us something about Jesus at each one of these feasts. During the Feast of Passover, at the end of chapter 2, and the beginning of chapter 3, when he speaks to Nicodemus, what is he revealing? He's revealing that a new birth needs to take place. A new people need to be created. That's Exodus language. So during the Passover celebration, Jesus shows up and he's telling the people, specifically Nicodemus, we need a new Exodus. John is using these feasts to try to show some of that. During chapter 7, we will have John talking about the Feast of the Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, and in which time Jesus is going to tell the Pharisees, I'm going on a journey. That's what the Tabernacle Feast was about, the journey in the wilderness. He says, I'm going on a journey to God, and where I'm going, you can't go. And during that time, as they're confused about what that means, they're celebrating this feast, which remembers that God provided food. John chapter 6, Jesus fed the 5,000. But also God provided water. John chapter 7, Jesus says, if you are thirsty, come to me, and I will give you living water. Again, all of these are brought up partly to set a chronology, but maybe more so to set the theme of who Jesus is and what Jesus has come to do. And the Jews needed to see that, but also Gentiles, who John is writing partly to. He's writing to a mixed crowd. They need to come to see that as well, so they need to learn a few things. We need to learn a few things about what these festivals meant. Now, having said all of that, which festival was this? I have no idea. Again, some people say Passover, some people say Tabernacles. I tend to think the Passover feast probably fits it a little bit better, but I really don't know. But I don't think we're supposed to know, because I don't think John really intended to tell us which festival this was. I think the reason he brings up that it's a feast is it highlights that what Jesus did in the Jews' eyes was not just bad, it was doubly bad, because this was a high Sabbath. When I say a high Sabbath, first of all of these weeks, when we think about Sabbath, we just think about the Saturday day of rest. Leviticus 23 reveals these weeks, they were entirely all Sabbaths. It was considered a Sabbath when it was the week of the festival. There was instruction on days of the week that you could not do any work on that wasn't a Saturday. And in fact, many of the high days, the Day of Atonement is like this. So when you think of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Jews today have arranged their calendar so that Yom Kippur, which is one day, it's a fixed day. If you know anything about our calendars, the fixed day is going to move every single year. It's going to be on a new day. Not in the Jewish calendar. It had up to a point, but then they fixed it so that it could never fall on a Friday or a Sunday. I wonder why. Because it's a Sabbath, and you cannot work on Yom Kippur. You cannot work on the Day of Atonement. And if it falls on a Friday or a Sunday, that is incredibly inconvenient, because now we can't work for 2 days in a row. And so they have fixed their calendar to make sure that these days of the Day of Atonement never falls, even though, according to the Levitical law, there are times when it would fall on a Friday or on a Sunday. So these are Sabbath weeks. These are important days of rest and festivals of rest for the Jews. But especially the Sabbath of the festival day was considered to have double honor, or to be higher or holier. And so whenever you have laws and traditions on the Sabbath and you get to a festival week, we ratchet them up. We turn those up to the highest that they go. These are days to be heavily revered. And it's on this occasion that Jesus comes to Jerusalem during a feast week on a Sabbath and not only heals a man, but compels him to take up his bed and walk. Let's think about that a little bit as we continue on in our story. The first thing I want us to think about is that this man was not alone at Bethsaida or Bethesda. He's not by himself here. Now, I've got an artist's rendition. Now that I've said the word wrong, it's all I can hear in my head. We have an artist's detailing of what the pool of Bethesda would have looked like. You can see it in the corner over here. If you picture the temple, the pool of Bethesda was on the northern end of the temple. And in this picture, we see that it's outside of the city. And that is most accurate for the days of Jesus. Now, later, the city was going to be expanded. And so, in this model that I have here, this is a model that if you go to Israel, this is a 1/50th scale of the city of Jerusalem. It's within the city boundaries. It's been brought in as the city was expanded. In the days of Jesus, he would have had to leave the city. So think about that. He goes out of his way. He leaves the city to come to the pool of Bethesda. And we had mentioned, writer's translation said 5 colonnades. Some of your translations may say 5 porticos or just simply 5 porches. All 3 words mean the exact same thing. And you can see them here. It's shaped like what we would think of as 2 separate pools, but it's really a northern pool and a southern pool. The northern one is a higher elevation, and the water that feeds into the northern pool would drain down over a dam in the middle and feed the southern pool. And these 5 colonnades or 5 porches were the porches that ran along the north, south, east, and west, and then one that covered that dam. And all of these porches were places where people would come, and they would lay, hoping to be refreshed by the waters of the pool. And John mentions something, and I don't think I heard it in writer's translation. I think some translations do leave it out. Some translations put it in. But if you're reading from the New American Standard, for example, it has a little bit more at the end of verse 3, and then it adds a verse 4 that is not in some translations. And the reason it's not in them is because in the earliest manuscripts, that doesn't show up. That part that talks about how an angel would come and stir the water and people that were brought down into the pool would be miraculously healed, that doesn't show up for a couple hundred years until finally it starts showing up in translations. Most likely what that is an example of one of our first commentaries. Somebody writing about what was going on or the belief of what was going on in the days of Jesus, that an angel would come down and stir the water. It does not seem that Jesus takes any stock in that this is going on. At the very least, he doesn't offer the water as a source of healing or a solution to the problem in any way. And also, in the time of Jesus, certainly afterwards, shortly afterwards, within 100 years, but in the time of Jesus, maybe already starting, was the worship of Asclepius. Asclepius was a Greek god of healing. Where did you worship Asclepius? Well, like I said, within 100 years or so of the life of Jesus, you worshiped him at the pool of Bethesda. And so it may be that they was already taking place here, that this is why people were gathering together. But now bringing it up to bring that point up, it's people. It's not one man. It's not just this one guy that's there. He, even in his own words, Jesus says, don't you want to get well? He says, I can't. There's so many people here, and I have no one to put me in. So when the water is stirred, somebody else gets in before me. There is a multitude of people who are broken, a multitude of people who are lame and blind, and they have no help, and they have no hope, except for what the stock that they've put in being made well by these waters. When you really think about what's going on here, it's heartbreaking. That there is this large gathering of people who need something and want something so desperately. They're living in some of the worst situations imaginable. And they're seeking a way to find a way out. And Jesus comes during this heartbreaking scene, and he chooses one. There's a multitude there. He chooses one. And I wrestle with that. Why just one? Why not heal everybody? Why not just show up and say, guys, the water is not what you need. I'm what you need. Everybody is healed. And if you're going to do one, why this one? Because what we'll see later, he doesn't seem to act like the most gracious person. So why does Jesus heal him? Well, the text does reveal something about him. Not so much about why Jesus heals him over anybody else, but maybe it is part of the reason why. The text says that this man has been an invalid for 38 years. Now, if you are thinking about Bible history, the number 38 shows up one other time in all of Scripture. Anybody know what that one other time is? I'll let you think for a second. What do you think that one other time is? If you're thinking the Exodus, you are correct. If you're not thinking the Exodus, I told you at the beginning of the sermon, the book of John's all about the Exodus. That's the other time that 38 shows up. Deuteronomy chapter 2 talks about this. Now, the time that it took for us to come from Kadesh Barnea until we crossed over the brook Zered was 38 years until all the generation of the men of war perished from within the camp, as the Lord had sworn to them. Moreover, the hand of the Lord was against us, or was against them, to destroy them from within the camp until they all perished. So, a journey that should have taken a small amount of time and that they could have completed within the realm of 2 years turns into a 40-year journey because 38 more years get tacked on to the end of it when they come to the edge of Canaan and refuse to go in out of fear. They refuse to trust in God, and they have no faith in Him, and they don't go in. 38 years of wandering around in the wilderness. 38 years of watching your family die. 38 years of knowing that you are going to die. And get this, how many do you imagine repented during that 38 years? How many do you imagine at some point of watching people, God says, look, I'm going to make you march around, and this generation surely will not go in, and you're seeing them all die, and you say, you know what, God, I messed up. I messed up. I am sorry. I want to do better. I want to go in. I'll go in. In fact, that's what they do immediately. They say, yeah, all right, God, we'll go in. And a bunch of them die when they just try to force their way in. How many do you think maybe repented? And yet, what happened? They died. 38 years is a number of hopelessness. 38 years is a number of death. We are not making it in to the land of Canaan. And this man has been in the exact same place. 38 years without any help. 38 years without any hope of ever being healed of his lameness. And it's this man that Jesus, the giver of life, John chapter 4, that's what we saw him, the boy near death, Jesus says he will live, and he lives. Jesus, the giver of life, shows up for a man who has been lame for 38 years, and he commands him to take up his bed and walk. Now, Jesus knew what he was doing. And there's some significant lessons that come from this. Jesus knew that what he was going to do was going to change this man's life. He was going to move him so that he's no longer just sitting around waiting to die. And like him, we have that same hope, by the way. Because of Jesus, we don't just sit around waiting to die. We have hope. We have help. But he also knew that he was going to cause an infraction in the eyes of the Jews around him. And it reveals something else about what is going on. Jesus didn't just come to heal a man who has been lame for 38 years. Jesus came to heal all of mankind. And especially, even though they're not gathered around the pool of Bethesda, there are Jews who have revealed they need to be healed as well. Their hearts are lame and are ill and have been so since birth. They have no hope. They have no help of changing. And so there are others that need the healing of Jesus who are going to reject it. So think about them for a moment. This man, who has been an invalid for 38 years, all of a sudden shows up in the city. He was outside at the pool of Bethesda. Now he's in the city, shows up, packing around his bed, his pallet, a mat. You would roll up your mat, and that's what you would have been resting on. So he's rolled his mat up, and he's walked into the city, and how do they respond? They say, "What do you think you're doing carrying your bed around?" Now, it's not likely that this is a guy that nobody knew anything about. He's been this way for 38 years. They've lived. It's not like he just moved into town. He had to be carried everywhere. He had to be carried there. So it's unlikely that nobody knows him, but having no significant thoughts as to the power that has taken place. No one says, "How are you walking?" No one takes note of that. And if this is the Passover, no one says, "How cool is it that you're walking?" On a day that celebrates when we had no power to heal ourselves of our affliction and God stepped in and rescued us. How cool is it that you're doing this today? How did this happen? No one says that at all. And in fact, when they ask him, "Why are you carrying your pallet?" he says, "The man who healed me," that should have been the whoa, because that doesn't happen either. So tell us more about that guy. Nope, don't say that either. "The man who healed me, he commanded me take up my bed and walk." Who's he? We have a bone to pick with him. They don't say it in the sense of, we want to learn more about how he healed you. Maybe he can heal us. Maybe he can heal my nephew or my neighbor or my uncle. No, they say it in the sense of, we want to find out why he would command somebody else to work on the Sabbath. Now, Jesus didn't command someone to work on the Sabbath. Jesus didn't break a high Sabbath or low Sabbath command. Jesus broke a tradition of the Jews. Jesus broke something that had been augmented by the words of men and had been augmented for the purpose of trying to make sure everybody is holy by keeping them all in the same box. We'll get everybody together in this box, and that way we will ensure that everybody is holy. By the way, they're doing this because they have the notion that if everybody is holy, then God is going to send a leader that is going to overthrow Rome, and we're going to be the people of God again. So that's what's prompted all of this. We're afraid because we have no power and because we are helpless, and the only way to get us out of this situation is to try and force everybody into holiness and righteousness, and so God takes mercy on us. So they go and they say, "How on earth could you be breaking this law?" By the way, it's not a law, but how on earth can you be doing this? And then how on earth can somebody else command you to do that? That's something that many Jews would have saw, by the way, is worse than actually working on the Sabbath. Because if I work on the Sabbath, that's judgment on me. The consequences of that are going to fall on me. But if I compel you to work on the Sabbath, that's murder. Because the consequence is going to fall on you. So arguably, it's worse what I've done than if I had just done it myself. And thus, that's the reason why they want to know who this guy is. Now, there's more to be read in the story, and we will continue on in the story as we come back to this account later on. But I want you to know that just like those Jews that needed to have their hearts healed, it might be that some of us need to have our hearts healed as well. Do we sometimes follow the same sort of logic that the Jews followed in trying to force everybody into the traditional box that we have of what it looks like to be right before God, because we are concerned that if we don't, They won't be pure, and if they're a part of us, we won't be pure. When someone shows up on a Sunday morning and their hair doesn't look like what we traditionally think hair should look like, or their skin doesn't look like what we think traditionally should look like in the sense of it's covered in tattoos, or their face is covered in piercings. They're not wearing a suit and tie like I'm wearing up here this morning. When they don't fit the box of what it looks like, how do we think about that? I hope what we think of is, how cool is it that you are here today? On the day that God has set aside to commemorate that despite what we look like, and despite how we acted, and despite how wicked our lives was, He was going to send His Son who was going to die for our sins so that He could clothe us in His clothing, so that He could turn us into His people. How cool is it that you've chosen today to come and try to find God? I remember worshiping with a man once, and we had a visitor, and he came in, and he found a couple of us standing together, and he just walked straight up to us, and he said, it was a younger guy, he said, I'm looking on a place that's on fire for the Lord. About like that. And I said, buddy, I think you might have found it. And I was just so excited to see him. And he sat down in his pew with his Mountain Dew and his shorts and his ball cap on, and it wasn't very long at all before a gentleman in the back got up and came to him and scolded him because we don't wear ball caps in the church. Haven't you read 1 Corinthians 11? He had not. And even if he had, that is not how we're going to approach that. It's not hard to believe that that young man is not a Christian today. Is it possible that we might need our hearts healed the same way that these Jews needed their hearts healed? Jesus shows up to show us the people that you think can never change, the people in helpless and hopeless situations are not outside of His power. I think what we should focus on is what the Jews should have been focusing on in this. Behold, this man's been healed. That's the very words that Jesus uses when He does find him again. He doesn't know who Jesus is. Jesus slipped out of into the crowd, into all the multitude, and he doesn't get an opportunity to get to know him. It's an interesting part of this story. This man is healed knowing nothing about Jesus who healed him. But Jesus finds him later in the temple. Something, by the way, that he was commanded to do and probably was unable to do for 38 years on this week. He's supposed to come and present himself before God. What's he doing when Jesus finds him? Presenting himself before God. And Jesus walks up and says, behold, you have been made well. And then he tells him something. Sin no more, so that nothing worse happens to you. I want us to kind of wrap things up this morning thinking about that last encounter that he has with him. So we're going to do an exercise. I want you to take just a second to think about what is the worst thing that could happen to you. Maybe just today. What's the worst thing that could happen? I've got mine. I don't have to think very long, but I'll give you a second to reflect on that. Because that's what this man's living with. He's living with the worst thing that could happen. He has no freedom. He can't even, I want to go get food. I can't go to the market and get food. I need somebody to take me. I need somebody to feed me. If somebody doesn't do these things for me, then I just don't eat. I don't have any help. He is living a completely helpless life. He's hopeless. He is living worst case scenario. What's the worst thing that could happen to you? Jesus shows up here and says, there's something worse than this. There's something worse than 38 years of being an invalid. There's something worse than 38 years of physical helplessness. That something worse is no doubtably eternal punishment. Eternally being separated from the God of healing, the God of life, the God of light, eternally separated from Him. And here's what's interesting to me as I reflect on that, as I prepared for this lesson, is my something worse, I'm praying about that every day. When we go and we look at pray without ceasing, and we go, that's a really tough passage to understand. How do you pray without ceasing? Let your worst case scenario show up on your door, and you'll learn what it means to pray without ceasing. That is simple to understand when worst case scenario comes close to home. As Jesus said, there's always something worse. When I reflect on that, I recognize I don't pray about something worse near as much as I pray about worst case scenarios. I'm not saying I'm thankful for them. I'm not saying that I'm glad that we have to face that. Man, do I learn something from them. I realize my life probably needed to be challenged to think about the true worst case scenario and pray about eternal separation and think about and reflect upon what God has done to save me from it and the life that He's called me into to live by faith in Him because of it. Jesus takes this moment to draw our minds to remember there is something worse. But He also takes this moment to make us realize whatever that was that you put in that worst case scenario, whatever it was that you filled that box in, that's the worst thing that I can imagine. If worst case scenario comes true, Jesus is bigger. If worst case scenario comes true, Jesus overcomes. Behold, you have been healed. I have experienced that in my life so many times when I thought, this is the worst that can happen. And Jesus got us through it. There's a funny, there's an interesting chapter in the Screw Tape Letters called The Law of Undulation, where Screw Tape reminds his nephew Wormwood that humans tend to forget the heights of the peaks when they fall off of them. They forget how high they were at because all they can see is the depths that they fall to. They also tend to forget the shortness or brevity of time that they stayed on the peak, and that the time in the valley or the trough will oftentimes be a similar amount of time. The point is, like a wave, life ebbs and flows. It has its ups, it has its downs. And he mentions that the most dangerous thing to the cause of the demons in drawing mankind into the house of Satan, most dangerous thing is when they hit the troughs and they don't understand why they're there. And they feel like God has neglected them. But nevertheless, His will be done. And they obey anyway. Jesus comes to reveal that what C.S. Lewis was writing about in that letter, which is not inspired and is not anything more than just an interesting story, is fixated on a true reality. The power of Christ to heal. All those 38 years that this man lived by that pool, he maybe didn't know why God had allowed him to live that way and didn't know if God would ever change his life. There was another man that was like that. The Apostle Paul reveals in some of his letters that he doesn't know if he's going to see the next day. He doesn't know whether or not God is going to allow him to continue on like this or not. But he knows this, that to die and to be with Christ is gain. And that everything that he would be losing would amount to rubbish in light of the eternity of being in the presence of God. What I take away from John chapter 5 is the awesomeness of a God who would look down on someone that has no power, that has no purpose, that has nothing to offer. Step into this world and heal him, and then just a couple years later, die for him on the cross. Not so that he could walk for the remaining time that he had left, but so that he could sit with him in eternity in praise of our God. Whatever it is that you're struggling with this morning, whatever it is that's in your worst case scenario box, whatever it is that is hurting your heart today, listen to the words of Jesus. Do you want to get well? It may not be that his answer to your desire to get well is that he's going to take away your affliction, that he's going to spare you from your sorrow. But he is going to bring an end to it. He is going to dry up your tears. He is going to heal you. And if you are here today and you have not yet become a child of God, he wants you to know that when he heals you of your sin, he has healed you for a purpose. Not just so you could be spared from hell, but so that you could live as his ambassadors. And you could walk through a life that has ups and downs, highs and lows, knowing that whatever happens, it will be okay, because he rose from the dead. And one day I will rise with him. And one day all the sorrows of this world and all the depths and the trenches and troughs that I fell into will be completely smoothed over. And the highs won't even compare to the heights that we will rest in when we rest with him. If it is your desire this morning to have that healing, or if it is your recognition that you have been healed but you don't live as one who is healed, you don't live as one who recognizes the words of Jesus, sin no more, that nothing worse will happen. My encouragement to you would be to come to Jesus again. Let us come to him and let us learn how he can heal us today. If that's your desire, we want to assist you in that. Won't you come forward and we'll talk together as we stand and sing.